Survival. I can know that I want my music to be charming as well. I was never, I went through, I endured, among the things I had to endure in my life, relocation and addiction were small compared to 12-tone music that I had to endure for 12 years while I was a student at Cornell and subsequently. You know, in the early 60s and early 70s, if you wanted to be a, quote, serious composer in the United States, you had to confront the whole world of semi-combinatorial or set music or 12-tone music of one sort or another. And usually the so-called Columbia Princeton establishment that really dictated how young composers could be successful. It was almost essential that you adopted a certain kind of writing that almost nobody enjoys listening to.
Well, let me ask you a question along those lines, because I think one of the things that I admire about your career is that you do go counter to type in terms of you are well known as a film composer and you've worked on top projects here in Los Angeles, but you are also very well known and respected as a concert music composer in all different parts of the world. So explain to me how that's possible, that it's maybe more common nowadays as things are more open, but how is that possible? It
is more common, yeah. Well, I think I was lucky. Not, I mean lucky in the sense of when I was born, and also the period at which I became well known here in Los Angeles and in New York. My first success became, success meaning my first break came when I was in Paris studying with Nadia Boulanger. She came to Cornell where I was an English major, for heaven's sake. I had a TA-ship in teaching English. But I was writing things and she came and she knew a talented, hungry person and she brought me to Paris with a scholarship. 10 years later, another person who had a genius for finding talented but hungry people, Roger Corman, discovered me and asked me to do my first movie, Death Race 2000. I see a certain resemblance there in my career changes in that I happened to be at a place when an opportunity presented itself to me and I was desperate or happy or just foolish enough to grab it. And I think that comes from a survivalist mentality. There was no question of failure for me. To me, failure is not getting a chance and not getting, you know, I love baseball almost as much as cats. There's nothing wrong with striking out in the World Series. What's bad is not getting to the World Series. If I ever get that opportunity, I'll swing, you know. So, so when I began, I won a prize. I won the Lily Boulanger Award in 1962. I got a performance at Carnegie Hall. My name just sort of got out there. When I came here, it was the early 60s.
And that was a performance prize?
Yes, no, it was for writing a piece, my first orchestra piece.
Okay, okay.
The judges were, besides Nadia Boulanger, Aaron Copland, the big name composers of that era. How much they participated in the judging, I don't know. I don't care. But I won a wonderful award. It was in the New York Times, and I got a performance. All right. Similarly, when I was here, the film industry was beginning to fracture, is that the right word? Beginning to break up a little bit. And there was a company called New World Pictures, president and producer of which was Roger Corman. And he was always finding hungry, talented people like Jack Nicholson, Francis Ford Coppola, me, and you know. And he paid us practically nothing. He gave us practically no, but on the other hand, he didn't ask what our credentials were. He didn't care that we knew nothing. He didn't disrespect us because we were hungry and willing to do anything. And in the end, he gave me a career. Because when that picture came out, there was a separate card that said music by Paul Chihara. I wasn't somebody's hoe, you know. I didn't have to orchestrate or synthestrate for somebody. So I've always honored Roger, even though he didn't pay me much money, even though I had to do a lot of things like doing voiceovers and things of which I had no experience, whatever. Nevertheless, I learned how to make movies as if it were a form of creative fun. Not a chore, not a job, and not something you did to get a degree. It was just something like fun. And at the end of that process, making this movie, which turned out to be quite a success, by the way, I had a career. And from that date, 1975 to today, 35 years, I haven't stopped working. Well, I honor that man.
Well, and every successful person that I ever talk to always says there was this person or this handful of people that helped me get that first and second opportunity.
Yes. And I think the survivalists that I talked about, that I've always thought that, and my father was like that also. He came from Japan, no education, whatever. Somehow he conned people into thinking he was a jeweler in Seattle, and he founded Chihara jewelry. Had no education. He couldn't tell a diamond from a piece of glass, I'm sure. But he became a jeweler. Think about that. I've always wondered how he did that. He survived the Second World War. He was arrested probably because he was a sensei, a teacher of martial arts, and they took him away. So he had a much harder life than the rest of us who were in a relocation camp, you know. But there was something about his optimism, because he came back pretty wild, I must say. But, but there was something I liked about this, almost like bohemian living. You know, if you grew up in the 50s, as I did, the world was pretty straight, even among Asian Americans. There were no hippies in the 50s, you know. There were beatniks, but they were in the East Coast or in San Francisco or something. Not as straight people, you know.
Right.
And then I went through the 60s, and I believe that a lot of the success that I had in terms of getting published, getting performances, getting my movie breaks and so forth, occurred because that era was so open. And I think frankly, I think being an Asian American did not hinder me at all in the 60s. Whereas it was a blight to be Japanese American during the 30s and 40s, needless to say. It was a great blessing in the 60s. I don't know whether I got work because I was Chihara, because I was told later by producer Dick West, you know, Law and Order, I worked for him. He said he thought my name was Chihuahua, and that he thought that he was hiring a Chicano. So that's a true story, by the way.
Wow, that's
right.
Talk to me about a career high point.
Well, gee, you know, I don't know what those are. I've had a lot of good moments. 2 years ago,
give me a good moment then.
Okay, 2 years ago I had my viola concerto premiered by the Cleveland Orchestra. It was a very nice success, a piece I'd worked on a long time. And it was a piece that I wrote while I was in drug rehabilitation. I started it then. So in lots of respects, that piece, which began at the time when the doctors thought that I only had less than a year to live because of a staph infection that I had. I was in St. Luke's Hospital in New York. I began the viola concerto there, writing it in my bed, no piano, no synthesizer, just writing it. And the Cleveland Orchestra performed it, all right? And it was hugely, so the piece itself is kind of a musical document of how I felt then, you know.
Wow.
The only piece I ever wrote that's in a minor key, so to speak.
You're a happy guy.
That's right, that's right. Well, it turned out well, and it's going to be performed twice this year in Los Angeles by the Coburn Orchestra, who are then going to record it. You know.
Excellent.
That would be one of the high points. I think another high point was working with the San Francisco Ballet when they performed my Tempest nationally. You know, it was on national television. And there's the possibility of another Broadway show that I'm up for that may happen. But there have been a lot of high points.
You've written for as we just discussed, concert stage, film, ballet, Broadway. Can you talk a little bit? Put on your mentor's hat here for all of us younger composers, and just talk a little bit about the difference in writing for each of these: film, concert, ballet, because there are different factors involved, obviously, different requirements.
Here's an interesting thing. Ballet and movies, I began those careers almost simultaneously. In 1974, I had quit a position that I had at UCLA. It was a tenure position, and I was just tired of teaching, so I resigned. And almost simultaneously, I got a phone call from Roger Corman's office asking if I would help them do some electronic music on a movie, which turned out to be Death Race 2000. And about the same time, I got a phone call or a letter from the San Francisco Ballet asking me to write a ballet for them. So within the space of 2 weeks, I went from being first an academic teacher and then out-of-work freelance composer to a film and ballet composer. I was the San Francisco Ballet's composer in residence for 15 years from that moment.
You're doing these two things at the same time.
That's right. But see, the commute from San Francisco to LA is not so great. Not nearly so great as when I'm going from here to New York, where my wife is. Or 15 years ago when we were commuting from here to London, where I was working for ITV and BBC. So traveling and working is part of what I consider, you know, one of the rewards or one of the price you pay for working. Now, I wanted to mention both ballet and movies. You would think they have a lot in common because they are basically forms of dramatic music. That is, music that accompanies something else, a story, for example. Although ballets often now do not have stories, it's much more conventional to follow Balanchine's model now to have purely abstract ballets without plot necessarily, although there is sort of a drama. When you have people moving and interacting, there's almost always a plot that's implied, it seems to me. But in any case, but the huge difference between ballet and movies is that in movies, the music can never step on the dialogue. Whereas in ballet, the music always has to obliterate the sound of the feet. Because the magic of a ballerina wafting through the air is completely destroyed when she lands and you hear boom and you realize that is not an angel but an athlete. You know, a beautiful girl with really ugly feet. You know, that's, I know from personal experience. Music has to cover that, you know. There are many things. But the other thing about movies and ballet, and that's what I would tell younger composers, is that both of those necessitate that you know how to get along dramatically with somebody else. And both ballet and movies are basically collaborative forms of art.
Okay.
And in each, and this is very different, the huge difference from being your own composer, writing, whether you're writing a song cycle or a symphony or a string quartet, when you're the composer, you're everything. You're the writer, the boss, the actor. But when you're writing in any other form, dramatic form, stage form, you're part of a dramatic team, and lots of composers can't ever get that. And there are legendary stories about how difficult certain famous composers can be when they have to work with somebody, you know.
And what do you find gratifying about that collaborative aspect of it?
Well, I think composers tend to be loners, at least when they're working. And what's nice about a collaborative form is that you're really being emotionally satisfied or fulfilled or challenged during the creative process. In a way that, listen, you've been a composer a long time yourself. Writing can be a solitary act, you know, even though you're married or you have whatever going around. When you're writing, you do your thing.
Absolutely.
When I'm writing a ballet, working on Broadway, I'm writing, but I'm never alone. It seems like the phone is always ringing, or somebody's there. I'm looking at a videotape, and we're always being challenged or applauded or whatever. But the interaction is such a part of the creative process. That's something that, you know, you can't teach that. Here at UCLA, I try to tell people, because students, of course, want to write great music, and they get into thinking that this is the way it's going to be, and regardless of what the teacher says, they're going to stick to their guns, which is good. But you can't really stand that isolated if you're writing a movie or a ballet, especially a movie, by the way. You know that as well as I do.